I have a terrible habit. I tend to get involved in fights on the internet. It's a bad habit. I know I really shouldn't do it, but sometimes I just can't help myself. And one of the things that always comes up around this time of year is the folk who say Christianity can't be true, the disciples were lying because people just don't rise from the dead. The apostles must have made the whole thing up because, again, people don't rise from the dead. And it's not bad logically. How many of you have ever seen someone rise from the dead with your own eyes? I can't say I have. We tend in our experience to be used to people being dead. And we don't plan on seeing them alive again until the resurrection of the dead. And we also know that people can sometimes tell very convincing stories when it comes to carrying on a lie. Not that any of us have ever done that, of course, but for argument's sake, let's say we've experienced someone telling a story that is very much not true, and you know it's not true, and they keep going anyways. You know who's really good at this? Kids. Kids are great at this because, and do you know what makes it fun? Kids don't know when their story has crossed from believable to unbelievable, and they will just keep going. And the story gets more and more fantastic, and it's really fun to listen to. But adults do this too. Adults all will come up with ways, especially if they're in trouble. They'll come up with a story to get themselves out of trouble. You hear about people lying about speeding tickets all the time. People lie about everything. But usually the lie holds up pretty well until there's any kind of pressure on the person. So while we might believe, for example, that the disciples would lie about Jesus being raised from the dead, we would also tend to believe that if their life was in danger, they would give up the lie in order to carry on living. For instance, in the early 70s, there was a certain rather big something that more or less ruined every mildly bad scandal to have ever gone on after it, such as Deflategate, Bountygate, Gamergate. I'm sure you can guess what I'm talking about by now. The gate that spawned all of the gates. The Watergate scandal in the early 70s. You all know this basic story, so I'm not going to bother repeating it, but the gist is that a few of the people involved, when faced with the threat of punishment, gave up the lie and essentially ruined it for everyone else. It didn't take very many people either, but just a few of them agreeing to testify for a lighter sentence, they brought down the whole thing. So if Jesus' resurrection was a lie, and the disciples were facing the kind of persecution that they would, somebody would have given it up. Given it up. I can words good today. Of all of Jesus' apostles, for example, of the 11 that were around after Jesus' ascension, only one of them made it to old age. Only John died of old age, and he was in exile at the time. The rest of them all died rather unpleasant deaths. Just reading through the book of Acts. You ready for this? Peter and John get arrested. Stephen gets killed, as we read in our reading today. The church is scattered because of the persecutions. James gets killed. Peter gets arrested again. Paul and Silas get arrested and flogged. Paul gets arrested and flogged again. Then Paul gets arrested and flogged again. And that's just in the book of Acts. The book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. Tradition tells us that Peter was crucified, Paul was crucified, Andrew was crucified, a lot of them were crucified. Others of them were just killed by the people they were preaching to. Countless members of the church were killed in these persecutions. And it would be really stupid if they were doing it all for a lie. If the threat of imprisonment is enough to get the people in the Watergate scandal to talk, the threat of death would surely get the apostles to talk. But they didn't. Instead, when they were going to their deaths, they continued preaching the good news. They continued talking about the risen Christ. They continued singing praise to God, no matter what suffering they encountered. Now, I'm going to assume, and I know what assuming does, but I'm going to assume that because we're here today, we've heard the good news of the resurrection, right? Yep. We heard it a couple weeks ago on Easter. We heard it last week as the disciples were walking to Emmaus. But do we really believe it? We've heard it, but do we believe it? Do we know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? Or do we just come to church on Sunday and go through the motions? If we truly believe that Jesus is risen, how good of a job are we doing of showing that? I mean, sure, it's easy to do this in church. He is risen. Did any of you tell anybody that Jesus rose from the dead outside of church on Easter? A couple of you did. That's good. I'm seeing a couple this and mostly this. I didn't. The closest I came was a happy Easter post on Twitter. And that really doesn't count. So what's our excuse? We don't really have suffering to worry about. I mean, we live in a place where the government isn't going to kill us for being Christian. So our life's pretty well safe. Christianity is still the dominant religion in this country, so we're pretty safe there. I mean, maybe if we talk about Jesus, somebody will think we're weird. But let's be honest, they already do. Like, I'm sorry if I'm breaking this to you, but people think you're weird. It doesn't matter who you are, they think you're weird. I think those geese are weird. I hope those are geese. They sounded like geese. It was very honkish. We don't really have a reason why we don't tell people that Christ is risen. We don't really have, you got me that time. The only reason we have is fear. But if we look at the examples of folk in the Bible, that excuse doesn't really hold up either. Because it's one thing to say, Jesus forgave the people that were killing him, but he was Jesus. We're not Jesus. Thank you that I don't have to be Jesus. Jesus was Jesus for me. But then we look at someone like Stephen. Stephen is just a guy. He was a nobody that got picked by the apostles after praying for a while to serve food to widows. That was his job. Everything he did for the church, it was to serve food for widows. And yet, he went out everywhere that he went and preached about Jesus. He went out and kept telling people about Jesus so much that a certain group of people got really annoyed at him and put him on trial. And when he was put on trial for talking about Jesus, do you know what he did? He talked about Jesus while on trial for talking about Jesus. When they took him out back to throw him off a cliff, he kept talking about Jesus to the point that when he was dying, he says, "Father, don't hold this sin against them." Stephen knew that Jesus was not dead. Stephen knew that because Jesus wasn't dead, that he too wouldn't die, that he too would be risen with Jesus. So when we go out in our daily lives, what's our excuse? Why aren't we telling people that Jesus rose from the dead? This is great news. This is exciting news. People need to know this. So let's tell people about the risen Christ in our lives. Let's tell people what we've experienced of Christ every day, what we've experienced every Easter. And let's show them what a life with God looks like. Let's show them the joy that we have knowing that Christ is raised from the dead. Let's be martyrs for God. See, that word there's a lot we attach to that word. But do you know why martyrs are called martyrs? The word just means a witness. Someone who has seen and shares what they have seen. So let's take the example of Stephen. Let's take the example of those early apostles and ask God to take away our fear so that we can go out and spread the good news. And I love doing this because this is a great season to do it, because he is risen.